Hey, Fred Minnick here, and I am about to taste the 3-chamber rye whiskey from Leopold Brothers. Yes! Giddy up. So after this tasting, you'll see an explanation of what the 3-chamber still is. You'll see an interview with me and Todd Leopold talking about this. So if you want to learn about what this is and how it's made and why it's important, stay tuned after the tasting. If you just want to see the tasting, boom. This is going to be real quick. You're going to see just a basic 3-point tasting from me. This is a Bottled and Bond, barreled in 2016. Ooh, 80% Abruzzi rye and 20% Leopold floor malt. There's that little bottle for you there. This is a sample bottle provided to me by the distillery. Now this is a bottle of whiskey I have been waiting on for a long time, and the reason why, well, you'll learn a little bit in the interview, but this is how they used to make whiskey, with a 3-chamber pot still. Let me take that back. It's not a 3-chamber pot still, it's a 3-chamber still. And you'll learn about it in the interview. Ooh, chocolate. Chocolate peanut butter, rye bread, crushed peanut shells, raspberries. There's a lot of freaking shit going on in this thing. This is really crazy. Complex on the nose. Floral. Good Lord. Herbally. Wow. 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 I love peppers. I mean, I'll go into any restaurant, and if they have peppers on the menu, I can see they got a lot of fresh peppers. I'll just take a pepper, whatever kind it is, whether it's a jalapeno or a nice chili. I'll just take a fresh one if I can get it. I'll just crunch into it. I love the crunch of a fresh pepper and that liquid that just oozes out of there after you've crunched a pepper. I'm telling you, this was like I did that process. Like I took a bite of like a fresh pepper and those oils just shot in the back of my palate. Man, is this thing spicy, beautiful, absolutely beautiful. After this beautiful spice, and it ain't elegant, it is in your face spicy. So after this like spice note, there is an underneath current of like black fruits. Beautiful blackberries, blueberries, black currant. This is got a lot of like black fruit notes to it. And get this, a hint, just a hint of black licorice. And that is like one of the notes that to me, like I'm always looking for. So in rye, like old school ryes, I look for like this black licorice note and I look for spice. And the spice level on this is a 10, you know. So if you like spice, if you like tasting spice in your whiskey, woo, giddy up. Man, this is some bitchin' good right here. That finish, the finish, after I've swallowed it, I've got the spice on the palate just humming there. It's really humming. I can feel it all the way down. This beautiful, the flavor receptors, the taste receptors in my belly and my throat. I can taste the spice all the way to my back tongue. And then as it's going down, it's blossoming on the tip of my tongue as well. So like it's like it goes back palate, goes down, comes up to the middle, just a little bit on the middle, like a kind of like a graham crackery note there. And then like on the tip of the tongue, honey. So like this beautiful honey note just blossoming. So gorgeous. I absolutely love this. This is fantastic. Congratulations to Leopold Brothers for, knocking this out of the park, because I'm not going to lie. When I learned about them doing the 3-chamber still, I was like, first of all, I knew they were going to spend a lot of money, but I was a little worried about the whiskey, just because no one's doing this, no one's done this in a long, long time. And so when that's the case, you're doing everything from scratch, and you don't really have anyone to call up and say, hey, on this particular type of still, what lever do I pull? So they did this on their own. So kudos to Leopold Brothers, and check out this interview that I did with Todd. Cheers.
So joining me here is Todd Leopold of Leopold Brothers. How you doing, sir?
Lovely day here in Colorado. I'm doing great.
Colorado is very beautiful right now. I imagine it's peak weather, a lot of hiking to do, a lot of fun stuff.
There are few places in the world that are as beautiful. We're very lucky here, and it's very well known for having 300 days of sun a year. Mm-hmm. And so it's hard to complain. A lot of people think that it dumps 10, 20 feet of snow a year in Denver, and we're at the foothills. We're at the edge of where the mountains are, so we get all the nice weather, and all the snow hits up in the mountains where you want it. So we're quite lucky. It's a beautiful place to live.
Now, when it comes to whiskey making, you've got a much higher elevation than Tennessee and Kentucky, obviously. But what about the climate? Like here, there's a lot of humidity. What's the optimum whiskey making temperature in Colorado?
Well, for us, the biggest effect that we have to deal with is the dryness. So it gets down to single digits humidity in August, and if you don't do something about that, you can wind up having evaporation rates, your angel share per year in the double digits, as I'm sure so many Texas distilleries and Arizona distilleries that deal with that. The way a lot of the other distilleries handle it is they age inside and humidify the air. What we do is we use dunnage style warehouse, which is similar to what you'd see in Scotland. So earthen floors, and the same stacking material that you see the wooden ladders called dunnage, to try and get more humidity into the air and to trap it in the building. And it works very, very well. So our warehouse, we get 20 to 30% more relative humidity in it. And our angel share, instead of being in the double digits, it's actually 4.1% a year. So you have to do something, or you don't have to. Actually, what am I talking about? You can just let it go. Or you can try and accelerate it, which is, of course, what some of the Texas distilleries like to do, which is cool too. But for us, we took a bit of a different approach, and we don't want as much of a aggressive oak character in our whiskey. We're looking for a bit more balance, and so that's why we use the dunnage style storage. It works very well.
Well, of course, like Leopold Brothers has kind of flipped the contemporary traditions of whiskey making, flipped it upside down a little bit, and from the moment that you started bringing a Maryland style rye to the market to your 3-chamber system rye, I look at what you all are doing is kind of like going through time and trying to find what really, really worked that kind of got lost. And tell us a little bit about your path to finding cool shit in the old days to bring to the present.
Well, I think a lot of people, sometimes mistakenly think that we're trying to make whiskey the old way. What we're trying to do is make the best whiskey that I know how to make. And a lot of the techniques that, in my opinion, made for beautiful whiskey were abandoned for reasons. So we talked about for cost reasons, and part of it is people forget that the larger whiskey distilleries held on, and I'm thankful that they did, and they had to find ways to keep the lights on, and that's not an easy thing to do when you're making a few hundreds of thousands of barrels a year through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and up to 2000 when whiskey got cool again. So this certainly isn't a knock on the larger distillers at all. They're my heroes. But what we look at is some of the procedures and processes that they use that are different. So I kind of touched on the dunnage warehouse. We use and have used an entry proof of 50% from day one. And this was the American standard in the late 1800s. And I know this from reading some old documents published by the IRS just right after the Bottled and Bond Act. There's a paper in particular that was published by Crampton and Tolman. These are IRS agents. So never let it be said that the taxing authority has never done anything for us. They did a survey of 31 different distilleries to try and define what makes bourbon, what makes rye. So it was leading up to making the standards of identity that we use now, the rules that we have to follow as whiskey producers and spirits producers. And in that paper, they showed the entry proof for all of these distilleries, and every single one of them was at 50%. I think the highest was 50.5. And of course, what happened in the 50s and 60s, as there was a bit of a glut, and you know this better than anybody, Fred, they thought they were going to have to make alcohol for the Korean War effort. They produced a bit too much, and they're trying to figure out, okay, well, how do we save money? And so they petitioned the TTB, well, what was the BATF at the time, but now the TTB, to allow them to put their whiskey down as high as 62.5. Obviously, that changes the chemistry of what's going on in the barrel. So the difference between putting it in at 50 and putting it in at 62.5, it's going to affect the extraction rate. It's going to extract color, or it's going to affect the extraction of coloring compounds. It's going to affect esterification. The easiest thing to kind of explain to whiskey fans is if you're putting it in at 50%, most warehouses go up a few points during the maturation process. For us here in Colorado, for some reason that I'm not smart enough to explain, our proof doesn't move. So we're in at 50% and we're out at 50%, which means bottled and bond here is also cask strength. But understand if you're going in at that higher proof at 62.5, and everybody that's purchased cask strength bourbons have seen, mid 60s, high 60s for proof. What happens when you have to bottle that at the usual strength of 45 or 47 or whatever it is? You're diluting all of the work that you did in the barrel. You're changing the nature of the whiskey by going in at that higher proof. So that was one of the big ones that we found. It makes a much softer whiskey at that proof, and it's just where we settled and what we prefer for the spirits that we make. But that's a big one. Mm-hmm. Another one is the alcoholic strength. And this is not just in America, but also over in the UK, Scotland, and Ireland. The tendency was to make alcohol strengths of 5 or 6% in the 1800s. And of course, if you look at a distillery that makes a 5% alcohol distiller's beer and a 10%, you're using the same equipment and doubling your yield essentially. So you can understand why they would move to that higher proof. The issue with that is that again changes everything along in the process. It changes how the stills operate. It changes how stressed out the yeast is during fermentation. So there's this, but your listeners may not. I trained in Germany for brewing. That's where I got my start. And there's an old Bavarian brewing adage for young brewers that your customers shouldn't be able to tell how strong the beer is until they get up from the table. And that always gets a bit of a chuckle, but what they're instructing you to do is to be patient, use lower temperatures. Don't stress the yeast out. Make sure that it has plenty of zinc, make sure it has plenty of nitrogen, and that you have a clean, happy fermentation. And if you do that in whiskey production in particular, as well as making beer, you can taste the grain, you can taste the hops in the case of beer. It's a much cleaner beer. And what I'm getting at is that when you go from a 5% alcohol fermentation up to a 10, that 10%, you're asking your yeast to do more work, to consume more sugars. And when you do that, you stress out the yeast. When you stress out yeast, it gives off compounds like ethyl acetate, which tastes like nail polish remover. Heat, hot. When people say this whiskey is hot, that's what they're referring to. They're referring to using these not only warmer temperatures in the fermentation, which is a very modern thing. So we ferment in the 60s. These days, most people ferment in the 80s and 90s, which again stresses the yeast out. It's going to create different compounds during the fermentation of using warmer temperatures, but also fermenting much higher. So you're asking the yeast to eat a lot more sugar, and that's going to change the nature of the whiskey. And, that's really, those are two of the big things. And then the last one, without getting into the 3 chambers still just yet, the last one is the amount of malt that they were using back in those days. And these days you'll see malt in 3 to 5% for an awful lot. Of course, the most famous rye at NGP famously uses 5%. Generally speaking, what that means is that you're adding enzymes to the process, because there's usually not enough diastatic power. So in other words, enzymes are the reasons that you're adding the malt to break down the starches into the simple sugars in the mash tun. And so many of these smaller distillers back in the 1800s all the way up to Prohibition would simply use brewer's malt. Brewer's malt, and I could obviously talk about this for about an hour, so I'll just try and simplify this as much as possible. Brewer's malt has a lower percentage of these enzymes that you need. So if you're using brewer's malt to make a bourbon or make a rye, you're really going to have to add up to 20% of this malt to make sure you're converting the starches into simple sugars in the mash tun. And of course, the difference between 20% malt and 5% malt, it's going to change the nature of the whiskey and the flavors that you get in it. So those are kind of the highlights of some of the things that have changed over the years.
And of course, it should be noted that a malt would be a very different practice than, throwing in commercial enzymes.
Correct.
Where do you stand on commercial enzymes?
I think everything that everybody does is fine. For me personally, we don't use it. The reason I don't like commercial enzymes is it breaks down the grain too much. Mm-hmm. So it depends on what your goal is. Are you looking for yield, or are you looking for flavor? And a simple way to look at it is, these commercial enzymes will break down a lot of compounds that the natural enzyme simply can't. So what that means is you're getting more yield out of the grain. The reverse of that goal is you're also making it so it's less flavorful, right? So in other words, if you're getting a few extra gallons out of the same amount of rye, what does that mean? That liquid is going to have less flavor from the grain. So quality suffers, and this is one of those things that is left over from, I studied eau de vie production, so fruit brandy production, back in the early 2000s before we started it, in the 90s and 2000s before we opened our distillery. And when you're processing peaches and apples to make a brandy out of it, a lot of the lower quality distillates, they'd add pectinates and other compounds that will break down these substances to create more sugar. What is that doing? That's making it so you're getting less apple flavor, less peach flavor. So to me, as a producer, I view it as a shortcut, and it's just not necessary if you're adding malt to a grain fermentation to add those outside enzymes. I think it dilutes the flavor, and it's counter to what we're trying to do here.
So we've talked about fermentation. We've talked about your love for low barrel entry proof. And as a side note, I remember, it's funny, like, people ask me all the time, like, what books do you recommend or whatever? And like, I don't like recommending my own books when somebody asks me that questions. I say, read old tax records if you want to understand whiskey. So I used to pour through like old Treasury testimony and even congressional testimony. I mean, that was my book, Bourbon, the Rise, Fall, Rebirth of American Whiskey. Almost 100% original sources traced to, government documents that, we share a passion for reading farm bureaucracy in the 1890s.
Well, it sounds strange, but of course it makes sense. And you can find, records from Powers and Jameson making testimony to British Parliament. That's where you find these things. And they're asking about, how Irish whiskey was made. It's where I came across the use of malted oats, which we do on site as well, to make an Irish style whiskey, I guess you'd call it. We're still about a decade away from releasing that, so forget I said that. But no, you're absolutely right. How helpful these documents are, and taxation documents, and understanding how the taxation levels affects the behavior of the distillers trying to save money and trying to find better ways. Very famously, Irish whiskey was, for a time, the number of stills that you had. So what did they do? Their stills got huge because they would save money. And if, these cascading effects that government regulations have on the economic behavior is a fascinating. It should be a field, I think, not just with whiskey, but just about everything else, where unintended consequences of regulations and rules. It's pretty fascinating stuff, or at least I believe it is, and obviously you do too. But I get grief all the time for what it is I find interesting to read on a Friday night to unwind. But you're absolutely right. A lot of it are government documents. And then also for brewing as well. The big difference here in America, because there were so few distilleries that survived, up until the boom that started in the mid 2000s. They didn't really have a trade association the way that they do for the American Malting Barley Association, that's been around for about 5 decades now, and then the Master Brewers Association that's been around for 100 years, and all of this repository of information didn't really exist in America. And of course, the reason, as you know better than anybody, is that the distillers in Kentucky and Tennessee just would have lunch because there were so few of them. That's their idea of transmitting information back and forth, which is beautiful in and of itself as well.
And my listeners who are watching live just pointed out my mic sounded like I was a little far away. I think that has been fixed. But one of the things that we talked about, like those government decisions, the change of the barrel entry proof in 1962 from 110 to 125, to me, I think really decimated a lot of the quality of whiskey. So the fact that you're passionate about telling that story makes me excited to have these conversations with the fellow geek. But I want to get into the purpose of us kind of chatting today, and that is the 3-chamber still. And I will put a link to your YouTube video in the description of the of my YouTube, as well as pin it in the comment section so everybody can watch it. I think it was a great video, by the way. But just kind of explain to us the 3-chamber still and where the passion came from for resurrecting that beautiful beast.
Well, it was the same IRS document that I mentioned that was put together, the study just after the Bottled and Bond Act was passed. And out of those 31 distilleries that I mentioned before, about half of them made rye. Mm-hmm. And every single one of the rye distillers, except for one, used a chamber still. And when I came across this document about 15 years ago, I wondered, like so many do, what the hell is a 3-chamber still? I didn't know what it was. But the fact that all of them were using it, to me was, okay, well, why are they trying to use it? And of course, your first thought is foam. Rye whiskey, especially with the grist bills that they were using, where most of them were 80% rye, 20% malted barley. And if you think about putting that into a pot still, I can't imagine even trying to do that. It would char on, it would foam like crazy. It would be a mess. So I started, down the road of, well, maybe this is because of foaming, and foaming can be an issue with that recipe in a column still. But then when I came across drawings and some discussions of how it operates, and a big one in particular that was in a metallurgical and chemical engineering flow sheet book of all places. So it's basically here's how creosote is made, which is the liquid that you put on the railroad ties. This is how sodium hydroxide is made. Here's the flow sheet. And they had a piece on what was at the time the largest distillery in the world in Peoria, Illinois. It was a Hiram Walker plant that opened, if I recall, in 1910 or somewhere around there. And in the flow sheets, they had 2 column stills and a 3-chamber still. And I'm looking at that going, if you're trying to they were making 100,000 gallons of whiskey a day. I mean, that's just, for me anyways.
That's a lot of whiskey.
That's a lot of whiskey. So I'm looking at that and saying, okay, well, if you have 2 column stills, what the hell are you doing putting a 3-chamber still in? Why would you do that? And of course, by this point, I had seen the drawings and understood how it works and realized it was because it makes a whiskey that the distillate is completely different.
Mm-hmm.
And once I got that figured out and saw some discussions, and of course had some what are, I guess these days called Dusty's vintage whiskeys that I got my hands on, then I realized, okay, the way that this still is designed. So a lot of people don't know a column still, and I left this out of the video. There was a lot of editing because my brother kept saying, this is going to be a 2-hour-long video. So we had to simplify things as much as we could. But a column still from entry in the top, the mash, the fermented mash cascades down and exits as animal feed. The design parameter for those stills from entry to exit is 90 seconds. So you have 90 seconds to get the flavors, to get oils, to get, everything that you're looking for in a bourbon. That's how much time you have, 90 seconds, that's it. The 3 chambers still, by the time you're done with it, it's 90 minutes of steam treatment. And that much longer amount of steam treatment, together with some other things that are explained much better in the video, particularly with the animation, you're extracting a lot of oil. So the way that it was marketed in a lot of pieces that I came across were as heavy-bodied whiskey. And when it's coming off of the spirit safe, which is basically just a hydrometer cup. I'm sure all your fans have seen one. It's a hydrometer cup with the alcohol spilling out. There's so much oil in it, even if it's coming off at 70% alcohol, that you'll see a meniscus that goes over the top of the hydrometer that's about 2 centimeters high. It's crazy. Mm-hmm. And so when I ran it on the first day, the very first time I ran it, I'm like, oh, there it is. That's why the mouthfeel is unbelievable. The amount of oil that's in it is unbelievable. And as you know, Fred, so many people are looking for a finish, and a finish that goes on for days. And if you can imagine how much, when you're pulling that much oil off, the oil is going to coat your mouth and make that finish go on. But what comes over with those oils are aromas that you're not going to get off of a column or a pot still. One of the reasons is the oils that are coming out, and that's going to carry rose aromas and lavender and these other beautiful floral notes. So that's part of what's going to happen with that. But the other thing, and I've completely lost my train of thought, I'm sorry. It's hard to explain these things without drawings and that kind of thing in front of you. But the flavors and aromas that come over are really just entirely different than you're going to get off of a pot or a column. You can see why we put that video together. It's difficult to pantomime and explain all of this stuff.
Well, that's perfectly fine, and I'll tell you that we like that sort of information. I think it's fantastic, and I know you built this with Vendome right here in Louisville, Kentucky.
Yeah.
Was it a just a design and build, or did you all have some hiccups? Take me through the process of building it, because it's been in works for a couple of years. I know that.
Right. Well, it was a lot of fun. It was one of the things, so what happened was I came across the documents, 15 years previous. David Wondrich, the wonderful historian, did a piece, I think, for Whiskey Advocate or somebody, like, I can't remember exactly where it ran. And I'd been wanting to install this for all of this time. And when that ran, I told my brother, I'm like, well, we better do it now, or somebody's going to do this before we get to it. And I approached Vendome. Our other pot stills come from Vendome, so we already had a wonderful long-term relationship with them. Mm-hmm. And I was working with their junior engineers. The Shermans work with the much larger distillers, and we're not a larger distiller. And eventually, as we were starting to work into it, first of all, they looked in their archives to see if they had any old drawings. Obviously, that's the first thing you're going to want to do. You figure if anybody had built it, Vendome. And Vendome had actually acquired another copper works at some time during their history, and they had a bunch of old drawings for that. They went through their library. They found nothing. And so what we were going with was what it is I was looking for them to do. And at one part, Mr. Sherman called me up and said, well, Todd, you're certainly doing some interesting things these days. And I said, yes, sir. We're trying to have some fun here and do something a little different. And he said, well, Todd, just wanted to let you know, I can't guarantee this still the way I can guarantee our pots or our columns, because I got to tell you, I don't understand what the hell this thing is. And I said, no, don't worry about it. Where Vendome was indispensable was the metallurgy. So if you think about a column, the smaller ones are 2 feet in diameter, the bigger ones get into the 5s and 6s. Relatively speaking, you don't have a whole lot of mash in it, but you're injecting live steam into that column. So there's going to be some vibrations and stress points. With our 3-chamber still, it's actually about 5 feet in diameter and 20 feet tall, with a lot more mash sitting in it. So instead of it just sitting on a plate, just a few centimeters of mash on each one of the plates, we've got 4 or 5 feet of mash in each chamber with steam bubbling through it, right? So it's a lot more vibration, a lot more stress. And where they helped was really taking a look at the stress points and making sure that it was safe. We actually put in on the back, we had your typical pressure and vacuum relief fittings on it, but we added another special one that we had located together off of a railroad car. So think of filling a railroad car with oil or liquids and filling it and emptying it. Well, how do you do that without having an air brake of some kind? And it's a special fitting that does both, that both releases pressure and also releases under vacuum at a much higher flow rate, just to make sure that the still was safe. So I thought that was kind of a fun little quirk that we had to add in there. There were a couple of adjustments that we made when it arrived on the pipe work. That was kind of to protect us and make it so that hopefully we'd be the first to come to market. And of course, now that we've gone through all of this trouble, I'm starting to realize what I had hoped when we started this is that we'd rekindle this old style. I'm realizing that this is so cost intensive. We're the only ones who know how to run it. I'm trying to picture who else would take to making one. We did have Fred Minnick came out a couple years ago. That was an awful lot of fun.
Oh yeah,
and he's just wonderful. He's going to be taking Beam into some really beautiful new directions. I think it's neat to see what the next generation is looking to do. We got along like peas and carrots. But he and I were standing at the still and trying to picture what that still would look like if we need to do even a small release, even a boutique release from Jim Beam, how big that 3-chamber still would look. And we're realizing, maybe this isn't going to happen and we're going to be the only 3-chamber still out there. But that was a fun day for me, having him out and go home to my wife and say, yeah, Jim Beam's great-great-grandson came out to look at the still. I guess more people are watching this than we thought. And then, of course, that night when I was trying to get some sleep, I'm like, oh, God, everybody's watching. So that was a bit of I didn't sleep a wink that night because, of course, it's a lot of pressure. You want to make sure that you're doing the still and the history of it justice. But by all accounts so far with the folks that have had it are very pleased.
Well, I saw my friend's David Wondrich's tweet about it, and I know he's a big fan. And I told you I wouldn't taste it until after we chatted, and I'm really looking forward to tasting it. I really am.
Well, I think you'll be pleased. I think some of the other distillers that have had it would say it's a different modality. So you're going to get, to my palate anyways, the floral notes tend to, they're of course in the nose, but on the palate, they show up in the finish. Mm-hmm. And that's really, really a unique thing. And the other thing that Dave Wonder had said to me was, he had always described this he called it a cedar note or a cigar box note. He thought maybe that what he was tasting from the old Overholt samples that he'd had from 1910 around that era, he thought it was maybe old growth wood. Mm-hmm. And that the flavor of the wood, and what my hypothesis is, the reaction of the oils is extracting different flavors and compounds out of that wood that kind of gives it a cedar note. And of course, it's a number 4 char independent stave barrel, who've been wonderful partners in this whole adventure. But I've had more than a few people say, boy, Todd, it just tastes just like old Overholt, which isn't what we were trying to do. What we're trying to do is make something delicious and tasty with the best tools that we know how, to get our hands on. We weren't trying to replicate. So I think some people get confused with what we're trying to do, where we're intentionally trying to be old timey. I don't care about old timey. What I care about is looking at some of these tools that may have been cast aside for no reason other than, money, and one of my fun conversations that I had, I'll slip this in, that I kind of skipped over. I ran into Lincoln Henderson before he passed away, and he was out in Denver at a liquor store, and I was there getting vermouth, which I always like to joke, I make how many different spirits, and what does my wife want me to get for her vermouth to drink neat? So I was there to go, what I call my walk of shame, to go buy her vermouth. And Lincoln Henderson is in the store. And of course, he had no idea who the hell I was. Why would he have any idea? I introduced myself as a young distiller and said, listen, I don't know why I brought this up of all things, but I said, we've been making whiskey for some years, and I've been putting down the whiskey at 50%. It's some of the older books, yada, yada, that I'd read about. And he looked at me, he said, well, that's funny. In the 1960s, I was in charge of the crew that was taking our whiskey from 50% up to that higher proof. I said, no kidding. And he said, yeah, we did a lot of work, and what we found, and I wasn't smart enough to figure this out, but he said what they found that they ran into was the color was the problem. So in other words, as they kept moving it up higher and higher, when they diluted it to bottle strength, it wasn't meeting their color spec. So that's what they used to cap how high of a proof that they were putting in. Isn't that interesting?
That is very interesting.
Yeah. So he's explaining this to me, and then at the end, I'm like, I realized I was taking up the time, and you know how those events are. They're trying to take them into as many stores as they possibly. Yeah. So I said, listen, fellas, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to take up that much time. And Lincoln leaned in and he said to me, but if I had to do it again, I'd keep the entry proof at 50%. And he winked. And what a wonderful thing to have. And I shared that with the Hendersons that story when he passed. But a completely fortuitous thing, right?
And the thing is Lincoln was great, and all the old timers would always say, the bean counters get in the way of making great whiskey, and everything that you talked about that led to the extinction of the 3-chamber still were money people.
Yeah.
I mean, you spent how much money to build this thing, and how much money is it going to take to keep it going, and how much, manpower is it going to take, and how much time are you losing, which leads to lost cases. I mean, so like the pragmatic business mind looks at this and says, you know what? We're losing 60% volume. Or we're losing 40% volume.
That is 100% it. Yeah.
And so, when we talk about, I'm just putting on my defensive posture here for you. So when someone says like, "Oh, you're just trying to do old timey things," that's BS. Those things that worked very, very well and were absolutely efficient just didn't churn and burn. In some ways, I would say that what whiskey became was like it started becoming a little bit of kind of like in the 1800s. I believe they have perfected the column still, and they've got it all measured out, and the science has probably overtaken the art a little bit. But you look at kind of when the 3-chamber still kind of went extinct, the column still was, I mean, it didn't yield as great as whiskey as everybody thinks. It was slowly evolving into what it is today, but the 3-chamber still, the pot still, those were largely inefficient. But it's basically like fast food versus fine dining in some ways. And
I agree with you, but some of it too, if I can, defend those larger distillers. You think about the alcohol production that they had to do for World War II. You can't make high proof alcohol with the chamber still.
Sure.
So when Uncle Sam comes to tell you to pitch in and to win the war, you can understand. I mean, I don't even have to look. I'm sure dozens of 3-chamber stills disappeared in World War II simply because of that. And they're like, well, do we want to bring this back or not? And then it happened again with the Korean War. I'm sure you've had the Shapiros on, here we go again. We're going to have to start cranking out. We've been down this road before. and I'm sure that led to a few of them distilling, or some of them leaving as well. But they're back in boom times now, happily. These larger distillers. So I guess it's possible that someone else is going to come in, and they know where to find us, I guess. Maybe Freddie we'll have a go at it, and I'd certainly love to work with him or any of the larger distillers on this. Would be a hoot.
Well, if I've learned anything in American whiskey, is there are copycats just waiting in the wings to copy it. So,
well, it's how do I say this? It's more complicated than it looks, and you have to have an understanding. I'm 25 years into my career now. A lot of people don't realize that in the whiskey world, the thing I've always gotten a kick out of, because we make gin and I'm sorry to say vodka.
I'm sorry. What did you say, Todd? You broke up there for me a bit. Yeah.
I always pointed out to Charles Cowdery that you can't make gin without vodka, and if you look at it that way, I don't disagree with you on the fundamental points. But when we we released our first spirits back in 2001, we couldn't get a wholesaler to return our phone calls unless we had a vodka. So, you got to do what you got to do to keep the lights on sometimes. But
yeah, and my whole philosophy too is more of a historic one, and how some companies also use vodka as leverage to get,
yes.
leverage. That's really where that comes from. I have no issues with anybody drinking vodka, or any distiller you doing it, but it is tongue in cheek, and who knows? I mean, the big troll of existence in the spirits world, maybe when I come out with my own vodka, who knows?
Well, the one thing I can promise you is that you won't have to buy our vodka to get a bottle of the 3-chamber. We don't play those games. We're a little too that's not our bag.
So let's speaking of that, let's tell everybody where they can get it. And are you all open to the public yet? Can people come and check you out now?
We are not open to the public yet, so I'm sitting in a very empty tasting room. We're about a month out. Just like everything else, COVID has slowed our ability to get the packaging for the 3-chamber still. So my hope was to have the whiskey out now. We're looking at June. It's going to go out to California, Texas, Illinois, New York, DC, Atlanta. People will be able to track that down. I'm sure we're going to get lots of calls, and we'll do our very best on our Facebook and social media to let people know where it's going to wind up going. But people will always be able to get it at the distillery. And if you can't get it at the distillery, that'll be a good problem for us to have, I guess. But we'll wait and see. We'll see. What's
your case count? How many bottles you got out there?
Well, we're going to do a first release. We're going to do a special release. It'll be hand signed, kind of a collector's edition to, commemorate. This is the first time we've had 3-chamber whiskey released in at least 5 decades, as far as we know. So that we're going to do 5,280 bottles. That'll be the first release. And after that, we'll have about let me think about this, about 1,000 cases a month available. So we made what we thought was enough for everybody to be able to, that's interested in it, to be able to get a hold of it. But as you and I both know, not only have things changed in the last 6 years since we built the still, things have changed so much during COVID. I'm blown away at the number of whiskey groups and the proliferation of people that are serious whiskey fans in the last 12 to 24 months. It just boggles the mind. So we're hoping to make it so that it's as available as we can possibly get it. I'm sure we'll reach out to some of your partners at Bourbon Pursuit. What we're trying to do is make it so that people who want a seal box and that sort of thing, we want to make it so that people who are interested in this can get it. We will do our very best on that count.
That's awesome. Well, I can't wait to taste it. The members got to see, my YouTube members got to see this live. We will take this interview and chop it up and pair it with my tasting, and also put it out there on the social medias and everything. But I look at what you're doing as something awesome, and I've always we both have a passion for great whiskey. And I have been so excited to see how small distillers are coming forward and putting their stamp on whiskey, and we're getting away from what people consider to be bourbon. We're going to the 4 grains. We're getting away from the MGP ryes, which are lovely, but that's not what rye is like everywhere. So I'm just so excited to see where things are progressing in what is my passion, because it gets pretty boring from where I sit to just talk about the same 6 distillers all the time.
Right. No, well, from my perspective, again, I started as a brewer in the mid 90s. The same thing happened to the brewing industry back then, and the idea that you could get a world-class German-style Pilsner or a Belgian beer in America was laughable in those days.
Mm-hmm.
And look at how much things have changed as to where, when I was at brewing school in 1996, I'll never forget the professors and a couple of the students took me out for the first night. And this is when I learned, boy, you have to have a thick skin as an American. They said, tell me, is it true? Can you open a brewery in America without having your diploma in brewing? And I chuckled and I said, yes, that's true. And one of them muttered, well, that explains so much. And, again, this was 1996, right? We're just really at the dawn of these small brewers. And it took time for, those to get, an formal education. And the same thing is happening with distilling. And you're seeing the people that are putting in the work. Alan Bishop is a great example, that you've had on, that have put the time in, that have put the work in and are trying to make, putting their whole soul into it, and not, as we like to say, they're making alcohol, yes, they are making alcohol, no question. But, how can you make something that's unique and that has finesse and that, and I'm now at the point now where, and Freddie Noe was very politely looking at me, as you can see the gray hair. He's looking at me as an old geezer, because I've been around for a while now. And it's more of us, Lance Winters, I'm sure you've had their bottle of whiskey out in California. It's more of us are getting into the kind of the midpoint, or at least what I hope is the midpoint of my career. I'm 25 years in, that we're going to start to really make some distinctive things. And that's what you want, right? You don't want it to all taste the same. You want different flavors. You want different ideas to creep in. And I think you're right. We're just starting to see that happen. And as these distilleries are getting more successful, as you mentioned briefly, this is really capital intensive. We had to pay for that 3 chambers still out of cash. It took an awful lot of, that's 15 years of work to get us to that point where we could afford to put the damn thing in. And letting that whiskey sit, it's going to be almost 5 years old. That's very hard to do. And tell the larger distilleries that you're not for sale and you want to remain independent is very difficult to do. But you're starting to see the breakthrough. New Riff, another wonderful example. The neat things that Arisman and the crew over there are doing. Mm-hmm. I think we're really rolling into a kind of a golden age of Woodinville is another one that comes to mind. Boy, I had a dram of theirs, and the orange that jumped out was unlike anything I had before. They're doing beautiful work over there, but we're getting there. And if you're a whiskey fan, boy, buckle up. I think the next decade is going to be an awful lot of fun in America.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more, my friend. And you're right there at the top of Mount Rushmore for distillers, for distillers changing the game. So it's great having you on, Todd, and I'm so excited to see what the future holds for Leopold Brothers, and more than anything, I can't wait to taste it.
I was just about to say, I'm dying to see what you think. I think you're going to love it. Take your time with it and enjoy that nose is all I have to say. I know you do that with all whiskeys, though.
Absolutely. Unless I have to taste like 500 in a weekend, then I'm a little quicker on the nose.
well, I'm glad you're not in San Francisco doing the whiskey competition. So maybe mull it over, have a seat, enjoy the misses, and have a dram over an hour. And I think you'll really enjoy it. You take care.
Cheers, my friend.
Bye-bye.